So welcome to the third in our trilogy of interviews, DVDs that we're making on Holistic World Vision. And this is the third one on non-duality, the final truth and the ultimate understanding. In the first one, we introduced Holistic World Vision and explained how we came about, what we're doing in the world, with special reference, of course, to the Aquarian cross, which is here, a symbol of perfect balance, and actually very relevant to the interview that we're doing today, because here is the Grail symbol of the second coming of Christ consciousness, that consciousness that now emerges within through perfect balance. And the Aquarian cross, of course, shows that, especially with the overlapping circles, the vesica piscis, the symbol of duality, but overlapping and coming into the perfection, the unity consciousness, the oneness in the center. And it is, of course, through that process of balancing the opposites within duality that we move through the center of our own being to come into the process of enlightenment, which is what we're discussing today. So the Aquarian cross, which is the symbol of Holistic World Vision, is very, very central to the mission, of course, and the explanation of what the Christ missions, first and second coming, actually are all about. So we also explained in that first DVD the energy work that we're doing around the planet and the activation of energy sites, the whole preparation of the planet for the new frequencies that are coming on to planet Earth by 2012. Of course, a lot of which have a great deal to do with the radiations of the sun and so-called global climate change, rather more actually in the cosmos than out of our exhaust pipes, but that would be the subject of another interview. So the second DVD was about the passage from non-duality, from duality into non-duality, and that is looking at the situation prevailing on the planet at the moment, where we are, as it were, at the final stages of a battle between these opposing forces. Tremendous light is now manifesting on the planet, as I've said, through the cosmic dimension, through the shifts that are coming, which are well described in the Mayan prophecy and in many other prophecies, incidentally, which all coincided around 2012. But in reflection to that, of course, are what we have called in our old language the dark forces of total control through fear, and what is being worked out now on the planet by certain elements that are manifesting that for us in ever more obvious way. So in that interview we looked at this battle that's raging within duality, and we were also looking at how it is we begin to start that process, or a portion of humanity that is called to do it, how we start to move within our own beings towards what is described as unity consciousness, as full awareness of the nature of reality, which is oneness, that all is interconnected and interdependent, as one holy whole, we might call it. And that then really is the subject of this third in the trilogy, which is, as I've said, about non-duality, unity consciousness. Could be called Christ consciousness, self-realization. There are so many different words for it. This in many ways is quite a challenging subject. In a sense, there's no reason for it to be, because it's in essence about our beingness. And we are, after all, human beings, not human doings, as the joke goes. And the difficulty somehow is that it's very hard to be in a state of being, just to be. We are constantly under pressure of obsessive thinking, and pressures and so on, to be anywhere but in the present moment, in the now, as it's called. So we're constantly taken out of center. The real fundamental of non-duality, and we all actually, although it may surprise everybody, are already enlightened. We are already one. We always were, we always will be. But as we're born into this dimension, with the eyesight that we're given when ego arrives age 2 years old, of course until age 2 we are perfectly still connected with the one. And we can see that babies have the most remarkable healing powers. You only have to pick up a newborn to understand the healing power of that connection. But at age 2, ego arrives as it's meant to in duality, and everything is labelled and names are given, and then the separation starts from there. But it's only an illusion in a sense, because that essential oneness, that essential connection with all that is always there. It's actually always right on the end of our nose, but we overlook it. If we had eyes on stalks that could look back to see the ends of our nose, we would remind ourselves, but of course we don't. So we're continually projecting into the outside world, into the world of duality, into the world of linear time and space, trying to make sense, yet with that missing factor. We're actually always feeling our separation. And that triggers us always to be searching, to be looking for ultimate union again, which is what, of course, is the impetus for much of our life's journey, is this endless search, and particularly those who become spiritually aware and are somehow searching for something. And that accounts for the New Age movement and all the workshops and all the books and everything and all the traveling. We're constantly trying to make that reconnection to something that actually we already are and already have. And that's the paradox. We need nothing more to be added. It is as it is. We are whole, except we think we're not. So this is the essence. It's a conundrum. It's actually extremely simple if we could let go of all our concepts and all the complicated teachings and simply rest in beingness, in the present moment as much as we can, and somehow back off from this obsessive thinking, which is really a disease that the humankind has inflicted upon it. I mean, we have many body functions, and thank goodness all those organs aren't on full flow all the time. It would make life very difficult. But the brain is an exception to that. It just continues, and we invest in it, and we identify with it. And as we identify with it, it leads us on incredible journeys and feeds the ego, which then thinks it's in control. The fact of the matter is that on careful inspection you will see that the ego is actually not in charge of our lives. Life just unfolds as it needs to, when it needs to. And looking very carefully and scrupulously, which is the only way to do this, at your own life, you will actually see and demonstrate for yourself that all kinds of events unfold that are unplanned, unforeseen, that are unknowable. And all of this unfolds in its own time, in its own way, as it needs to, when it needs to. So none of this is actually really incredibly complicated. It's just so obvious, and as I said, so much on the end of the nose, and certainly not comprehensible by the ego and the mind, which are indeed tools to navigate our way through duality. These two, the ego and the mind, actually can't understand what we're alluding to now, and are certainly not happy about hearing of these truths, because in fact it spells the death, in a sense, of both. And that is a struggle. The ego doesn't like the sound of that, and the mind will challenge it at every intellectual level. which is again why it's important while you're listening to this, and if it resonates with you at all, to put the mind on hold and become passive, to move into a kind of a passive mode, because in that state, almost a trance-like state, the words that are now coming out will in fact trigger deep inner connections, knowingness at a heart level about ancient sacred truths, and allow them to grow, maybe some small green shoots, or to regrow, to remind ourselves, before the head comes back in with endless questions, because the head always turns up and says, ah yes, but, oh yes, but. So the minute the head starts its butting process, we tend to lose the sacredness of what we're talking about now. So the advice while you're listening to this, incidentally, is to be as passive as possible and to allow the truths to settle, and then to see how you work with them after a while, after 24 hours or whatever. So that's very briefly the introduction. It is a philosophy that's not just been invented to challenge us or to annoy us. This is something that goes back to the dawn of creation, of course. It is all about our essential unity and oneness. We can take it right back as far as Lemuria and Atlantis. The Lemurian beings were not fully separated. They were very fine vibrational, higher consciousness beings who hadn't fully separated. By the time we reach Atlantis, of course, we have the story of the sons of the law of one and the sons of Belial. And those of us who know about the last Atlantis some 12,000 years ago know that there was, just as there is now, a great splitting of a dimension within duality, and you have those who were dedicated to power and control and technology, which eventually went wrong, and we understand the continent was destroyed. And before that time, the sons of the law of one, those who are in what we're talking about today, had already anticipated that, no doubt, and had begun to separate themselves and to settle in different parts of the world and carry that energy through. We then, of course, have the Master Jesus, all the great teachers, the Buddha, who were all teaching, essentially, they were teaching non-duality and oneness. The problem, of course, was that humanity, we can say now, is not that aware, but in those days they were incredibly unaware. Therefore, teachings all had to be watered down into a dualistic format, because that was the way that they were comprehensible at that time. But behind it all was always this allusion to oneness. Jesus said, the Father and I are one. Thy will, not mine, be done. The Islamics say, inshallah, if it pleases God, God's will. So all the time there are references and allusions to what appears to be a clear understanding that actually it is the divine will that is manifested through us on the planet, and not our own egoic paths and programs that we think are playing. Actually, something else is going on behind the scenes, and is the predominant power that manifests on the planet at the time. So we have the history, the historical background to it. Of course, this was also taught in the Vedic traditions of India, and in more recent times we have self-realized masters like Ramana Maharshi, who was at Mount Arunachala near Madras in India for some 50 years in a self-realized state. We have Nisargadatta Maharaj, all kinds of wonderful beings who taught non-duality. Advaita, it's actually called in the East. It means not two. That there are three paths, they say, other than, of course, if one suddenly comes into unity consciousness, and it can happen in the twinkling of an eye, in a flash, that you suddenly realize these truths and own them as your own, and you have knowledge of them. That is an instantaneous enlightenment. It does happen. But the more usual ways, there are three ways towards enlightenment that the human soul is drawn towards. One is the more intellectually based, which focuses the mind, and that is Advaita. The second one is transference, which is being very close to a spiritually potent master or lady master, and being in the energy and aura of that person, and that energy transfers. So there's a transference process, and there is also selfless service. We might perhaps mention Mother Teresa or people like that who dedicate their lives entirely to service. So those are the three normal ways the soul would pass through, and in common with all these paths is ultimately surrender of ego. That's what they all have in common. It's not that anybody can decide, okay, on Monday morning I'm going to surrender my ego. It doesn't actually work like that. It's not a process. In a sense, it can't be read about, but it's something that just happens and that is programmed within the blueprints of our lives. It's as though there is a moment in the program that's running where, if enlightenment is to manifest in that blueprint, then a certain time is already fixed and known for it. So those who are drawn to those paths, they all have in common this surrendering of ego. Now, it's not death of the ego, as some people dramatically call it. That is an exaggeration. The ego, of course, is a very essential element in the world of duality, in holding all the subtle bodies of the overall body together. It needs a coordinating factor, and that is what we would call the small ego. The problem is when the ego becomes overblown, and the analogy is that the ego that actually is best seated in the passenger seat of a car moves into the driver's seat. That's what we call the overblown ego, that thinks it's in control of all the mechanics of the entire vehicle, and that it is in charge of the life. That is what we're looking at in this process of moving towards non-duality, enlightenment and self-realization. The study of non-duality is exactly to inquire into and establish self-knowledge. So that is the whole point of non-dualistic philosophy, so that we're looking at who it is that lives. Who actually are we? What are we actually doing? That's what the great sage Ramana Maharshi always said to his students. Keep asking yourself, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Never stop. Whenever you have a spare moment, ask yourself once again, who am I? And eventually, it breaks the ego down until you realize that you can't define yourself as any bit or part of you. You're not a little toenail, you're not a kneecap, you're not an ear. There's nothing actually tangible that can define you. And in the end, the great truth was that we are nothing but presence awareness. That's all we actually are. There is really no egoic self in the final analysis. Once the surrendered process has taken place, then it is literally thy will, not mine, be done. And there is a process of moving back, in a sense, from the drama of life. It's exactly as Shakespeare said. He said, the world is a stage, and we're simply actors on that stage, and we play many parts in our life. So we then become, once this process is reached, the audience in the theatre. We're sitting in the audience, observing the play of life. Now, we have our roles, we have a destined blueprint, and if you look back at your life, and this, as I keep saying, is the only way you'll establish the truth of this for yourself, because you can listen to me forever talking about the experience that's coming through this entity. I've had a very extraordinary life with all sorts of different phases, which I could never have known about, chosen, or understood in any way from the phase before. They've simply unfolded as they needed to, when they needed to. And what I am suggesting is that each person can look and analyze their own lives and see how essentially the whole thing has gone in a flow. And it unfolds as it needs to, not as the ego would necessarily like it. The ego is usually the first critic of this whole process. This isn't good enough, that should be better, this could be this, that ought to be different, if only. All this kind of language comes in. But the ego is not relevant to this. This is an unfolding of a divine blueprint that, in common with 6.5 billion others on the planet at the moment, is like a vast jigsaw puzzle. And every bit of that jigsaw puzzle fits precisely as it needs to. The idea, of course, and it's been proven now in quantum science, that we actually live in a vast hologram where everything is in perfect synchronicity and works precisely as it needs to when it needs to. The brain, they say, is also a hologram. So once we understand that, we know that we have a specific role and it unfolds as and when it needs to, and we are able to detach as far as possible, to observe the whole process. We then start to move into a state of inner peace and tranquility, because there is infinitely less stress involved when we know that whatever's going on at the particular time is a program unfolding. It's orchestrated. The idea that we are simply impersonal vehicles of divine grace manifesting through us. Working the divine will through 6.5 billion people in this vast jigsaw, which is all the process of the expansion of consciousness and the divine, as it's said, experiencing itself through us as a collective. That's the understanding of the principle, essentially, of non-dualistic philosophy and non-dualistic living. So in our current world, we have the majority of teachings, both religious and what we might call New Age, are still dualistically based. And that's as it has to be. The vast majority of people, what we're talking about now in non-duality, according to a recent a study which was carried out using muscle testing, which is interesting kinesiology, by Dr. David Hawkins. He created a scale of consciousness from 0 to 1,000. We have talked about it on the other DVDs that we've done. And the top of that scale is the area of enlightenment, of in the region of 700 to 800 calibration. And relatively few, actually extremely few in a population of 6.5 billion reach those levels. This is what we might call the top of the pyramid as an analogy, perhaps the capstone. And it is those very, very high vibrational beings, the beings I've mentioned already, the self-realized masters. We have plenty of contemporary ones, beautiful lady masters like Mother Mira, Amma Chi, the hugging grandmother, all these marvelous realized people who carry a tremendously powerful energy and aura. This is the consequence of reaching the enlightened stage. We've talked about that process just now, but the consequence of that is that our personal vibrations lift dramatically, so that coming into the energy or the aura of these great beings through transference that I've talked about affects our own consciousness. So they occupy the pyramid, the top of the pyramid, the capstone of the pyramid, but they are few in number. We might call it perhaps a critical mass. That critical mass was something that was referred to in the Revelation text, of course, the 144,000. Many people think, oh, well, that's just a nice bunch of New Agers polishing their crystals and their angel wings and so on. But this is actually much more focused than that. We're talking about a minimum of 144,000 totally self-realized masters and lady masters on the planet, and their combined auric fields and energies that have a direct impact on the rest of humanity and the living consciousness of the planet at this time. So it's all about critical mass, but in numbers it's all relatively small. We are not talking of 51% tip over point of the whole of the human race. It's certainly nothing to do with that. It's a small critical mass of extremely high consciousness beings. So back when the study was conducted in the middle of the 1990s, very, very thorough study working with many pairs of people, muscle testing with kinesiology, David Hawkins discovered that in those times in the mid-90s, it was about 1 in 10 million people had any interest or any magnetic pull towards, or I don't know what else you describe it, what we're discussing here today. That's not many people. It's extremely small. Since those days, of course, we've had huge amounts of energy pouring towards the planet. The whole planet is going into different areas of space. We're heading up towards 2012. There are galactic superwaves coming out of the core of the Milky Way. All sorts of dramas that we've got, the magnetic pole shifts going on. So obviously all the energies on the planet are dramatically changing and we're all beginning to feel it. So I dare say there would now be many more beings that are both interested, involved and destined to be part of what is called again in Revelation's text the sorting of the wheat from the chaff, which is the raising of the frequencies of consciousness of a certain portion of the race from the rest of the race. And that seems to be underway. And don't forget also that we have a constant inpouring stream, redemptive stream I call it, of beautiful souls who are incarnating as indigos, as crystal children, children of the sun. They've all got many extraordinary names. And for these souls, what we're talking about today would actually probably not even be necessary, because these will come in, they will not plunge into the depths of duality and ego and all the rest that we've been through and all the conditioning. They will remain clear and pure and hold their unity consciousness, and it won't be even something to discuss in the years coming. So that number is beginning to increase exponentially. We're certainly at our critical mass point, I would think, by now, but the rest of humanity is still working through the dualistic process, and that dualistic process has ego at its center. And when you look at the standard of virtually all teaching in the spiritual region, it all presupposes that there is an ego, that it has a free choice and a free will, that it has responsibility, that it needs to make effort, that it has volition, that it has the powers of forgiveness, etc., etc. That is the essence, the structure, and the basis of all spiritual teaching at this time. It's certainly religious, and it goes 99% through the New Age movement as well. So what we're talking about here today, when you remove the ego factor altogether from the equation, and the ego simply is not involved in any of these processes that we've just described, we begin to come to a rather rarefied zone where not many people tread. And the intellect, as I said before, doesn't like it. The ego certainly doesn't like it, because it can see that it's the end of its reign. And we then move to a point where what we've talked about already becomes manifest, and that is that we are actually a program unfolding, and that everything that happens needs to happen. It's all as it's meant to be. Now that is fairly strong language, because of course we immediately start looking at the world as it is. We see the imbalances, the horrors, the fears and everything else that are going on. I can only say, putting my own ideas into that, is that we are at the end of an enormous cycle, It's at least a 26,000-year precession of the equinox cycle that we're coming to the conclusion of in 2012. When you look at humanity and the way humans have treated each other, certainly in our immediate history, but in prehistory, we've been pretty savage and pretty incredible things have happened. The karmic balances have certainly been disturbed over a long period, and we do understand esoterically that everything needs to be brought back into balance. So an awful lot of what is going on at this time, although extremely unpleasant, I could only see as the preparation for the next stage of human evolution, and these are the finishing touches to bring things back into some kind of balance after these years of intense confusion within duality, and certainly a lot of cruelty. When you look at the human race, very often the levels of cruelty are certainly far worse than those of the animal kingdom. And the premeditated aspects and the deliberate processes are really, really mind-blowing. So yes, it's a tough call that everything works out as it needs to, but that is the principle. This is a planet in which everything is allowed. All the possibilities are here. Everything works out holographically, as we've said, and we are then left with the blueprint that we have come to serve. That is our sole purpose here. We are going to connect to probably not more than a few hundred souls during our Earth walk. There are 6.5 billion out there that we shall never meet. We have specific soul group purposes. We meet not by any chance or coincidence, we meet by perfect synchronicity, and we each live through a drama that is already prescribed. It's already written. It has to be lived. In this level of understanding, all is already created. This is a created reality. And it's interesting when you consider psychic readings, palmistry, numerology, all the other techniques that are still so much used in the East, incidentally, not much used in the West, but in the East. In the East, a chart is drawn up for every child that comes onto the planet because you can tell immediately what that child is here for, a lot about its blueprint. So all is marked, all is already known. What tipped me finally into this philosophy was going to India a few years back and having what is called the Nadi palm leaf readings. And that is an extraordinary process where, written on palm leaves many, many hundreds of years ago, they must have known that a certain number of humanity would come forward to have the full details of their entire connection with this planet read for them. There'd be some reason for it. Those leaves, many, many thousands no doubt, were prepared and guarded and rewritten over the centuries, and now souls are being drawn to India to have their Nadi palm leaves read. It's not by any means everybody on the planet, but there are those souls that are meant to have it done. So you go to this particular reader and he draws out on the information is your birth date, time and a place of birth, because nobody else could have been born in that spot at that moment. So that's your key into the Akashic grid. And so they then have that information, and on that basis simply draw the Nadi palm leaves out of a great book, 2 lines of Sanskrit, information, 2 lines more information. In a 3-hour period, I was given my entire connection with this planet, where I came from, what the purposes of the various lives were, the main purposes of the main lives, where we are now, where it goes into the next stage. The entire spectrum was known and could be delivered. And don't forget that beyond the 3rd dimension, all is now. There is no time and space. All is now. So the entire story was known within the hologram of this particular entity, what it was doing here, why it was here, and all its purposes. I knew within the depths of my being that it was absolutely accurate. And then, of course, you have to start asking yourself, well, if all is known, what choices, as it were, at an egoic level are there really? Of quite honestly? And what, at an egoic level, what free will is there? And what responsibility at an egoic level can you take for the whole drama? And what efforts need to be made by the ego? And what forgiveness can the ego be involved in, set in these circumstances? And you begin to see that although no doubt there is a collective free choice and free will, which is, after all, the will of God, because we're all connected as one. And as a collective, no doubt, the whole drama moves and sways through the universe. I wouldn't be able to answer for any of that. It will work as it needs to work. And we, sitting here, are certainly not capable of having the overview of all that. There's no doubt about that. But at a pure egoic level, in this third dimension, although it is meant that it appears we have free choice and free will, and I mean every day people can say, yes, I do, so I can have the free choice to pick up my glasses case, and now I have a choice to throw them at the camera operator. I mean, all these things are apparently free choice. But as Ramana Maharshi, the great sage, once teaching said, he picked a handkerchief up and dropped it, and he said, that action was known from the beginning of time. At that moment, at that particular space, that was to happen. It's as precisely choreographed as that. So as you begin to then look carefully at life, you begin to ask yourself about choices. After all, in a world of oneness, how can there be a separate ego that chooses? You then have to look at, do you choose your thoughts? Of course you don't. Thoughts are impersonal bubbles that just pass across the screen. If you let them go, they clear in about a second, unless you decide to apprehend them. And then, of course, you've got a dance with another thought form and more thinking. But essentially, they just pass across. You have no control over them. There are so many other examples. Of course, the ego claims all the wonderful things that happen in life, but it doesn't claim all the disasters, all the horrible illnesses, the fatalities, all the nasty things. Oh no, that is destiny, isn't it? The things that you don't like are destiny. So you can't have it both ways. And there are many, many other examples of choice. I mean, if, for instance, everybody had free choice, wouldn't a very large proportion choose enlightenment? It is, after all, a far less stressful approach to the whole life process. And if everybody were given free choice of this vast unaware population, what do you think everybody would choose? Would it be viable? Surely everybody would choose to win the lotto. They'd all choose to live in mansions and have luxurious lives. How could that calibrate within the whole greater picture? No, we all have to have a blueprint that obviously has a mixture of joy, of drama, of tragedy, of everything else for the whole thing to work. After all, if you have a really good production of Macbeth on a stage in the West End with all the best actors and everything else, the play has been very carefully crafted, has been written to come to some particular conclusion, and every single aspect of it must manifest according to the script. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work. So in life, you can't just butt out and say, well, I'm not interested in this, I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee or something. You don't have that option anyway, but it all works together. The whole thing is in a perfect synchronistic balance, each one of us with a blueprint that is every bit as important as any other blueprint and melds in perfectly with that. Now, the ego may not like it, as I've said before. So we've looked at many aspects of this philosophy, that we might call it, this very natural state of beingness, this state of presence, which is really what it's about. It doesn't really need a lot of analysis. The problem is, truly, that it can't actually be taught. You can't teach something that is your natural state. So those who are involved in encouraging others to start looking at this, we often call it the process of repenting. And repent is not flagellation, it's turning your thinking around. It's looking at life from a different perspective through different lenses. And so a point of repenting and looking at life through a different perspective. It's emphasized that the same things will happen anyway. According to this philosophy, you are on a fixed blueprint in every single detail, down to the very last detail, as a matter of fact. Every single detail. So all works out precisely as it needs to. We are, in fact, fully enlightened, always have been, always will be, as we've emphasized throughout. And all is here now. There is no other reality, there is no out there. All the projections are an illusion. The whole universe is represented in the cellular structure of your body, the billions and billions of cells. All that is apparently out there is here. There is no other reality than now. This is it. In this moment, this is it. We are the divine in manifestation right here, right now. Nothing needs to be added to it, nothing subtracted, no criticism of it. It is as it is. If that consciousness can connect and be meaningful at a level of knowing, not belief. This is not about a belief structure, this is about knowing. That's why we work with the heart and not with the head and the ego. They're on hold at the moment. This is a heart exercise of resonance, of knowing. If we can accept the full significance of presence, of beingness, then we come to the final stage of this presentation, which is that peace of God that surpasses understanding, the deep inner stillness, that absolute rock solid firm center of your essence that can never ever be touched by anything at all. It's completely independent. The peace of God that surpasses understanding, understanding being the head. As we've emphasized all through, the mind is not designed to, is not the tool for it, and it can't understand it. The mind is about separation analysis. It's about negotiating the world of duality. It is not relevant for this. Therefore, the mind and its questions and its endless buts are not part of what's being presented now. When that can be silenced and put to one side, the thinking begins to reduce. This obsessive thinking begins to reduce. The numbers of thought bubbles coming through the process reduce. And we are left in a state of tranquility, of inner peace and stillness. The peace of God that surpasses understanding. And at that point, it may be not surprising, if you followed what has been said so far, that a number of the great ones, the ones that are self-realized, simply revert to silence. Because there is nothing more to be said. There are no more opinions, no more theories, no more concepts. All simply is as it is and unfolds as it needs to. And that is the ultimate realization. On the question of forgiveness, of course, looking at it from the context of non-duality, there is no entity, no ego to forgive. In the understanding that all flows as it needs to, then every act, everything that actually happened, was destined. So when it comes to forgiveness, in a sense there is a forgiveness process. It's not about two egos interacting, pretending in a sense that one will so-called forgive the other. What the real forgiveness is the total acceptance by both that it needed to happen. That is the forgiveness, the ultimate forgiveness and the complete detachment. So again, acceptance, going with the flow. When it comes to responsibility, the ego certainly likes to think it has. We're taught about it, we're given a lot of conditioning about it. But when you consider the vastness of the whole program, the enormous hologram that we're part of, and just small cogs of the hologram. If one is not able to have an overview of truly what it's all about, which we don't have, we have glimpses, we have bits and pieces, it's very hard to be able to understand what responsibility we can actually take. Our blueprint will unfold whatever it needs to within the greater scheme of things. So if our blueprint takes us into being very concerned about the planet, and we've got now the global warming drama and everything else, or the global cooling because there's huge debate about it, then no doubt that entity will be in Copenhagen right now, because that's when we've got this great world gathering going on, and we'll be shouting and fighting there with the best of them, because its blueprint is directly connected with that, and that is how we would term responsibility for the planet. But we can all have the blueprint involved in what appears to be responsibility in so many different ways. But there'll be other people's blueprints that to some will not be very responsible. But it's the mixture of the whole thing that is what matters, not a bit of it. It is all holographic, but it is the whole direction of the entire process that obviously matters. And we're simply not to know that. That's why trust is so important in the whole process, going with the flow. We really have no option there at all. There is no choice in that. It is part of an unfolding process. So the guidance for this, if there is such a thing as guidance, I mean, perhaps you can't even use that word, but when the detachment from the drama on the stage has been completed, and we really do truly sit in the audience and watch, we are detached from the whole process of what goes on, except for our own specific contribution. And that's the only way really it can be described. And many of the things that we are taught to take on as egos simply become irrelevant. And the peace and the lack of stress that comes with that, the raising of the vibration as a result of the peace, is, of course, the greatest contribution to the shifting consciousness on the planet. Because don't forget what was said during this interview was that as you reach the higher vibrations of beingness, so that has an exponential effect on the entire process. So all those beings moving into the levels that we're talking about, into the capstone of the pyramid, are having the most extraordinary effect on the entire reality at a subtle level that is the greatest service. And if you like to call it the greatest responsibility, the greatest intention, and all those words, it could all be jumbled up together. But as you move into your beingness and your inner stillness and your vibrations rise, you are producing a phenomenon on this planet.
Sorry. So basically, I just want to use an example of Iraq, for example, and the people living there. You're basically saying they have to get to a point where they can accept that had to happen, that they had to be invaded by the Americans and British, and all hell broke loose. You're saying that the Iraqis...
All situations, and Tibet, which is a horrible one, yes. That happens to be an old energy centre. The old energy centres don't fare well, I can tell you, because you've got Persia now, where all this drama is unfolding, and you've got Jerusalem next. Don't think it'll be any different there. It seems to be how it works, that centres that have held, that's what that video is about, these energy points of Robert Kuhn. The old energy centres that focused the power on the planet. In duality, a great light comes into them. At the other end of duality, a tremendous darkness manifests, which it did in all those places. In Tibet, the negative side of Tibetan Buddhism and Shambhala and so on, very dark energy in Persia as well, and look what's manifesting now in Jerusalem. Couldn't be darker. Well, you've been there yourself, you've done the research. So it's all part of this unfolding. Now, on an individual, personal level of emotional suffering, this doesn't help. It doesn't. It doesn't help. Except that if you're at peace and you raise your vibration, you are doing more on this planet to counteract all that you're talking about than anything else. So the fact that you are peaceful within yourself about it and not emotionally stressed and traumatized, which brings your energy down, you will be making the very best contribution of what has to be. And it's not directly your blueprint. If it were, you'd be there. So it's again sitting in the stalls in the theatre, observing the whole play. And set against that is fantastic light going on, wonderful things happening, of which I see as I travel the world all the time. The light is pouring into the planet. There are many, many things to counteract and balance all these things out. So it is a very dramatic time. It's a huge West End kind of stage production. You're sitting in the audience and it's all going on at every level. And in the end, one has to admit that bodies are physical bodies. That's all they are, and they come and go. We're talking about consciousness. This today is consciousness talking to consciousness about consciousness.
Yes, I guess.
And nothing else.
Yeah, it's just somebody in a war zone hasn't got the luxury, I suppose, to be able to think because they're just thinking about, their child that's going to die.
Of course.
I was just using it as an example.
But what's going to happen? What's going to happen in the earth changes? What's going to happen in all these things that are coming now? Because there will be, it's not going to be much to do with CO2 coming out of the exhaust pipes. There's a hell of a lot more coming on to this planet. A very, very strong possibility that a large portion of the human population will not go through this shift. Look at the way they're living. Look at where they're living. In a sense, it's a mercy. But these are not going to be easy times. And individual cases are horrific to contemplate in that level. But we all pass. All these bodies are part of a process. And we have to, there is no option. It has to be taken. There's nothing that can be done. No wand can be waved. Except this peace and tranquility within the self that maintains a vibrational level that is steady and constant, and that together with others. It's like the 10th insight of James Redfield. The 10th insight was two people going along a path together, one very steady, the other one dipping and coming up and down. And every now and again this one would fall into the horrors of the world, and then he'd come, oh, you're back again, are you? Great, oh good, we'll go on together, and then up and down. It's the steadiness that matters. The steadiness of the detachment, not an emotional freezing or anything like that. In your connection with all that is, you are immensely compassionate. That is the compassion demonstrated. And it's the vibrational frequency that is the key to the whole thing. The human heart can go the lengths of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries breaks, cracks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows. The thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us until we take the longest stride of soul men ever took. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is exploration into God. Where are you making for? It takes so many 1,000 years to wake, but will you wake for pity's sake? From St. Francis of Assisi. The mind does nothing but talk and ask questions and search for meanings. The heart does not talk, does not ask questions, and does not search for meanings. It silently moves towards God and surrenders itself to him. Essene Foundation Prayer. Divine presence within, living in wholeness, moving in joy and love, I surrender to your will. Bring the radiance of your light into my heart and mind and merge with me to manifest your will upon the earth. a Sanskrit poem written more than 5,000 years ago. Reach out beyond knowing and embrace oneness. Healing as you go, breathe the living word, restoring creation. Share the spiritual fire and let the mystic light of God fill you to overflowing. Ultimately, there is only one truth, one pure, blessed reality, that the powers of love will pervade and overcome all things. We will rest in utter completion of wonder. We are not alone, but we are within the same mystical unfolding. Happy are we only in as far as kindness and vision live within, shining outward. Words are shadows, acts are born of real caring and loving. A truth in stillness do we share in the moments beyond time, fleeting touches of an ultimate, total embrace. Within these things lies the most sacred and simple mystery of all. We are loved utterly and completely. And from the sage, the great sage, Indian sage Muktananda, there is nothing but you, nothing different from you, nothing to attain other than you, nothing that can be taken from you. That is all you need to understand. There is nothing to know other than that. Meditate on yourself, worship yourself, kneel to yourself, understand yourself. God dwells with you as you. And another prayer of St. Francis, to thee we raise our whole beings, vessels emptied of self. Accept this our emptiness, and so fill us with thyself, thy love, thy life, thy light, that these thy precious gifts may radiate through us and overflow the chalice of our hearts into the hearts of all we come in contact with this day, revealing unto them the beauty of thy joy and wholeness and the serenity of thy peace, which nothing can destroy. And from the Ashtavakra Gita, which is a beautiful text that initiated me myself, in fact, into the philosophy of non-duality. A few short verses. Intentions are the root of samsara. Samsara means scars. Therefore, the abandoning of intention and volition means dispassion with the world and freedom from bondage. You are not the body, nor does the body belong to you. You are neither the doer nor the experiencer. You are consciousness itself, the eternal, impersonal witness. Live in peace. All keep exerting themselves and yet find themselves unhappy. They do not realize that this is the very volitional effort based on desire that brings about unhappiness. It is only through this very understanding that the Blessed One reaches awakening. With the split mind healed into its holy wholeness by the mere listening to the truth, and with total serenity prevailing continually, the awakened sage is not concerned with the propriety or otherwise of any action, nor with inaction. The ignorant person does not attain liberation in spite of various disciplines and methods for controlling the mind. The Blessed One stands established in the self merely through intuitive understanding. Here, clearly understanding that nothing is actually done, in reality, the man of wisdom remains established in his natural state, witnessing whatever happens. Just to conclude our presentation, I thought it would be helpful for people who are interested in what we've been talking about, who perhaps need a little bit more feeding, perhaps, of the mental faculty. I've said all along that the mind can be put on hold, but obviously at a certain point the mind will need to engage as well as all the other parts of us. So for those who are interested in reading more about it, there is a very lively non-duality group of people, contemporary writers and press and so on, and these books are available and can be obtained easily enough on Amazon or through Watkins, which is the main esoteric bookshop in London. and in many other places. So if there was a germ of interest in what we've been talking about and you'd like to develop it further, these are some of the books that have helped me on my path into non-duality. The Ultimate Understanding by Ramesh Balsekar, who has recently passed on. He was the secretary and assistant to the great Nisargadatta Maharaj. He was himself the director of the Central Bank of India for most of his life, and in his retirement he came to help Nisargadatta Maharaj. He's written many, many wonderful books, and The Ultimate Understanding is one of them, very strongly recommended. And another very beautiful one with a wonderful title called Perfect Brilliant Stillness by David Cass is also a book that I enjoyed very much, with a lovely title. A very good one here by Paula Marvelli, Teachers of the One. She's, it was one of my early books that I read. She's quite intellectual herself and was following this path very much from the head, and she herself admitted that it would only cause her frustration, which she writes about. But she interviews many of the great self-realized teachers on the planet at the moment, and it's a very, very revealing book. And she's quite self-deprecating about herself, knowing that she's approaching the subject from an intellectual point of view, which is perhaps not the best, but it reveals a great deal of how many of us look at the subject. And so that's a wonderful key. A provocative title, You Were Never Born. And this is by John Wheeler, who's written many books on the subject, and excellent, very, very good author indeed. The idea is that, of course, the challenge to the ego straight away. There was no separation at birth or afterwards, not in the real sense. So you were never born. And an English a teacher in England, Tony Parsons, very well known, and he gives various satsang meetings where people who are interested in this but still have doubts or mental conflict can go along. And in the course of an afternoon of mainly meditation, sitting in silence, then it's possible to voice the difficulties. And Tony Parsons is a master of being able to turn the question round and to show that it is essentially ego-driven. And that's the great skill, something that I'm hoping to eventually acquire, haven't got yet. But Tony Parsons is marvellous at that, and his book, one of many, is called The Open Secret. Most of these people have got websites and can be looked up on Google as well. We referred to him quite a lot during the talk, and this was Sri Ramana Maharshi, who lived in Mount Arunachala near Madras in southeast India, self-realized and just lived on the mountain in beautiful simplicity with the animals, giving teachings, oral teachings. And we have visited this place, I have on a couple of occasions, and the energy is still fantastic, transcendent, and I feel that his overlighting energy has been enormously helpful in my own particular path. So Sri Ramana Maharshi, Timeless in Time. And then an Australian who's highly recommended called Sailor Bob Adamson, and these books are edited by John Wheeler, who we've mentioned before. Presence Awareness, which is what we said in the talk, was all that we can identify ourselves as in the end. When ego is released, presence awareness is all we are. And another provocative title, What's Wrong with Right Now? Bringing us into presence, into unity consciousness, into the present moment, rather than projecting into the future and chewing the bones of the past, all of which are actually irrelevant. Everything is now, and everything is determined in this moment.